Hello, my name is Kevin Yank, and I'm the Principal Engineer for Front-End Engineering at Culture Amp. And we have a bunch of open engineering jobs I should get out of the way right up front. If you like what you see in this talk, you should come and work with us on it, and just visit our website at cultureamp.com/jobs. So I'm here today to talk about how Storybook is eating all our tests. Before we get into it, I'd like to acknowledge Jakob Riedel, who is a principal engineer at Culture Amp. And most of the work that I am showing in this talk is his. He spearheaded all of this stuff at Culture Amp. Jakob likes to remind me that he gave a talk about all this stuff at Melb.js 6 years ago. And it's just that back then, this was all kind of cutting edge, barely possible stuff. But today, the tooling is so polished, I would recommend any team that is building a React app to consider this as their testing strategy. So, with that out of the way, let's get into it. We'll start by talking about the test pyramid. If you haven't heard about it, test pyramid recommends this profile for the types of tests that you write. At the base, the majority of your tests should be unit tests. You should write fewer integration tests, and then the smallest number of tests should be end-to-end tests. And the reason for this is that end-to-end tests are the slowest running tests and the most expensive to write and maintain. And so anything that can be tested with a cheaper, faster running test should be pushed down the test pyramid, and therefore most of the tests you write should be unit tests. Now, over the past year or so at Culture Amp, we've made a pretty big shift away from the testing pyramid, at least on the front end, towards a testing profile that Kent C. Dodds on his site testingjavascript.com describes as the testing trophy. And the biggest enabler of this shift has been a single tool, Storybook. Storybook is an open source front-end workshop that lets you build and compose components in isolation and embed live examples in rich documentation. Down the left-hand side there of the UI, you can see the list of stories. And each story represents a UI component that is running in a given configuration or scenario. It should be obvious that this tool has been really popular with design system teams, that their product is a library of UI components that they want to document and make easy to refer to for the teams that consume the design system. But in recent years, Storybook has sneakily become a really full-featured development and test environment thanks to a couple of attributes that it has. The first is that Storybook is extremely versatile. Yes, it runs components, chunks of UI, even whole screens in isolation. But it then deploys that to a static site that you can share with people who don't have your code base. And finally, it can also run in your continuous integration pipeline as a test suite. Storybook will run each of your stories and fail the tests if any of those stories fail to render. Storybook is also extremely extensible. And to give you just one example of how we have extended Storybook to create a workflow that wouldn't exist otherwise at Culture Amp, this is a picture of Smartling. This is the translation management system that we use to get human translators to translate the text strings in our user interface to a dozen or so different non-English languages. And if you want to get really high quality translations, the best way to do that is to give your translators lots of context. So what we did is we built this extension for Storybook. And I don't want you to read this code, but I'm showing it all to you here just to make the point that it's not that much. And in fact, half of it is comments. What this extension to Storybook's test runner does is that after it runs each story or test, the last thing it will do is take a screenshot and save it to a PNG file on disk. And then what we do is we upload that library of screenshots along with the JSON string library to Smartling as a translation request. Smartling's API conveniently will match the strings that you've asked to be translated against the text that it is able to detect with OCR in the screenshots that you upload. And so at the end of the day, what a translator who is looking to translate the text, subject has an updated goal, will see is this screen, and they can just glance down and see the text to be translated highlighted in blue with a dashed outline there. And this whole like detection and highlighting of the text in the screenshots, that is all done by SmartLing. But this workflow is only possible because we were able to link into SmartLing from our Storybook build. And with every translation request, we also upload a complete library of screenshots for the UI code base to be translated. So coming back to tests, let's start with unit tests. And I'm going to take you up the testing pyramid and see how things have shifted at CultureAmp. So a unit test classically looks something like this. This is written in Jest, which is a very popular testing framework for JavaScript. And we say, if I pass this function these arguments, then I expect to get this return value, and for maybe there to have been these side effects. That's the classical formulation of a unit test. And when it comes to testing UIs, you might end up writing a bunch of unit tests that look like this. These are tests for a component called myComponent. And basically this is saying, hey, my component, can you render with these props? And how about these props? And how about these props? And if you're looking at this and thinking, well, each of those tests could be a Storybook story, gold star for you, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Let's just think of these as pure unit tests. The most important thing that these tests are doing is checking if our function, which happens to be a React component, can accept arguments of a certain type without crashing. And if you want, you can also write expectations that test whether the rendered DOM matches what you expect. But that job of enumerating all the different types of props that your component can accept in a series of tests, that's really the most common job of unit tests. But in JavaScript, there is a better tool for that job. And you can see that if I introduce a typo to this prop here. So that says local now, and I immediately get a red underline thanks to Typescript. Typescript removes the need to write a bunch of unit tests that verify if your component can accept certain input types and reliably return certain output types without crashing. Typescript, instead of running as a test suite, it runs in your editor by performing static analysis of your code. So it gives you a much faster feedback loop than writing unit tests. Now, don't get me wrong, unit tests are not useless. They are still good for some things. They're good for non-trivial logic in non-visual modules. They're good for frequently changed or refactored code. And if you've got a problem to solve that is too big to hold in your head all at once, test-driven development using unit tests as a backstop as you work iteratively through solving that problem is a really great tool that I still use all the time. But we definitely no longer use unit tests as the biggest category of tests that we write at CultureAmp. In our testing trophy, the bottom of the trophy is now formed of a broad base of types, thanks to Typescript, and then a relatively narrow list of unit tests that we use as a specialized tool for those specialized things to test, for which unit tests are especially well suited. Moving on to integration tests, this is where Storybook really shines. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk today, it's that Storybook stories are not just an isolated dev environment or visual documentation for your components. They are integration tests with superpowers. The testing pyramid, remember, told us that we don't want to write too many integration tests because they are too slow to run and too expensive to write. And so we should use unit tests instead wherever we can. But Storybook stories run live in your browser as you work, and so they are as fast to run as hot reloading. And Storybook is such a polished tool now with such a large ecosystem of add-ons that an individual Storybook story can test more things than any test you've ever written before. And so in aggregate, Storybook stories are cheaper to write than unit tests. So together, Storybook stories cover almost everything that we used to write other kinds of tests for in the past. And this is why I say that Storybook is eating all of our tests. Storybook stories are so easy to write, they run so fast in our build pipeline, they provide so much coverage for the things we need to guarantee about our front-end code that on new projects, we're looking at about 80 to 90% of the test code we write is Storybook stories. So enough talk, let me show you what this actually looks like in the real world. And this is a Storybook story. This is a Storybook for a app at Culture Amp, which is the plan app for our performance reviews product. And what you can see here in this story is a full page of our product. And it's not just a static snapshot, it's interactive. You can mess around with it here, and a lot of the view logic is wired up and works. So this is why I say our engineers spend most of their time now in Storybook as their development environment instead of running the full app on their machine. When we group our stories, you can see we've got a folder called Pages here. So our standard is to create a Storybook file for each of the pages of our product. So if nothing else, our Storybook is an instant visual inventory of all of the pages in our product. Then we've got a list of modals here, and then finally components that were built in isolation. So if I click Edit Action button here, you can see this story just has a drop-down button in it right here, and there are 4 stories for this button in different configurations. Storybook also supports responsive viewports. So if I go to this questions page, this is a good example to show it to you in a large mobile viewport. So yes, and this is still fully interactive and hot reloading as I work on this UI in development. So it's got you covered for responsive design. It also has right to left layout, so you can write Storybook stories that have right to left locale baked into them. This is that same page we saw before, except in Hebrew. And it's good to have this as a test case for each one of the pages in our product. But you can also just go to any page and switch the locale to Hebrew and view that page in right to left. So I'll switch back to English here before we move on. Storybook also does accessibility checks. So you can see here in this panel, the accessibility tab is showing me that this screen has 4 accessibility violations, and I can even highlight them here. And this is telling us basically that our table component needs work, which is something that we know at Culture Amp, and we're looking forward to rolling out a new responsive table component in our design system soon. And one of the things that new component will address is these accessibility issues in our tables. Next up, we've got interaction tests. So let me go to test filters here. And when this story loads, you can see a bunch of stuff happens because there are scripted interactions in this story. We can see this on the interactions tab here, where you can see a list of all the interactions. And if you've ever written browser tests with Jest and React Testing Library, this is the exact same API. Those tools have been integrated into the core distribution of Storybook. And so we can rerun those interactions. We can even click one of these interactions and it will run only up until that point and let us inspect this intermediate state and then advance only when we're ready. So this is a really powerful testing and development environment. The last thing I want to show you is Chromatic. And this is a paid service that sits on top of Storybook and takes visual snapshots of each of your stories and alerts you in your pull requests when there are visual changes in your build. So you integrate it with your GitHub account, and Chromatic, as part of your build, will build the stories and take visual snapshots of each one. It will also provide static hosting for your storybooks. So every version of your storybook that you've ever created will be available for all time, hosted by Chromatic, which is a nice convenient side effect. But the main thing it provides is these visual snapshots. So if I click through to this visual change, it will show me the before and after screenshots for my pull request. This is on the main branch, what it looked like, and this is what it now looks like on the page titles branch. And I can toggle on and off the highlighting of the changes. And this tool provides a really great visual review workflow for your pull requests. And indeed, you can get your designers involved and set a rule for yourself that no pull request will merge with visual changes in Chromatic until a designer has approved them. And you can browse the full list of Storybook screenshots here at the bottom as well. So that's Chromatic, highly recommended. Let's take a look at the code that powers this. So when you write Storybook stories, you write JavaScript files in this API called CSF, or Component Story Format. Right alongside your component.tsx file, you will create a component.stories.tsx file, and it has several exports. First of all, at the top, there is the default export. This provides the default configuration for all of the stories in this file. In this case, we're just specifying that the component for these stories is my component. And then below, we have named exports for each of the stories that we want to appear in our storybook. And the simplest way to specify a story is to provide it a list of args, which for React components will be used as props. So you can create a series of stories, each passing different props to your component. And what this will look like in Storybook is this in the sidebar. So it's a group under the My Component component with 2 stories underneath it. At CultureAmp, this is an example of a real-world CSF file. So again, we have our default export at the top that provides configuration for all of the stories for Edit Action button. It shows that we're going to group them under the Components folder. And we also have this Parameters key. This is where we provide configuration for any of the add-ons we have added to Storybook. And in this case, we're using the Next.js add-on in order to stub out the Next.js router. So when we write a story that displays an entire page, if that page tries to inspect the route of the page that has been loaded in order to get an account ID from the URL, for example, in this case, we are going to give it the account ID 12345. So we don't have to write any special code in our stories to replace or stub out Next.js's router. We just provide the static values here, and when those components use the use router hook, they will get those values transparently. And then further down, you can see we have a list of stories, draft, scheduled, and live, each of which passes different props. And we're generating some of those props from JavaScript code. So because this is a JavaScript file, you can pull in things from other files. You can massage test or fake data in order to provide them to your stories. It is extremely flexible. If we switch back to our real storybook here for a second, I want to show you one more thing about how we write stories. So for Edit Action button that we were looking at before, you can see this button has 4 different stories. And yes, the 3 of the 4 have a different label, but the real difference between these states of this component is the contents of this drop-down menu. You can see we have a long list for some of these stories, whereas for other states we have a very short list. And that's kind of invisible at the moment. Wouldn't it be great if we could see those differences immediately upon loading the story? And not only that, that we were testing those changes in Chromatic. So if we accidentally dropped or misrendered one of those menu items, we would catch it. Well, we can do that with an interaction test. So just as I was clicking on that menu item or that menu arrow to open the menu, I can put in a play key for this story that will say that within the canvas element, and I need to fix the imports here. I will open up the pop-up menu by clicking the element that has the open menu text as its label. And if I save those changes and I go back to the scheduled story, that's just what we see while it's rebuilding. There we go. Our menu is automatically open for us, and I can pop that open and confirm that the interaction was run there, and we can see it before the interaction runs if we still want to. Yeah, and now this state is what will get screenshotted by Chromatic. You can even move this play key up into the default export at the top of the Storybook file to automatically perform this interaction for all of the stories in this file. So super, super versatile and flexible. So if you weren't keeping track, Storybook tests cover view logic, visual rendering, accessibility, localization, UI interactions, all in an environment where engineers can actually see what they're testing at all times and even share that visibility with other team members, for example, designers. Now, the one thing I haven't talked about is back-end data, and this is a common question that arises with Storybook. Do I need to run my back-end API service alongside my Storybook so that those full-page stories can load their data? No, you don't need to. And the way we've solved this is using a library called Mock Service Worker. If you haven't heard of it, it is a really powerful mocking library, and you can define mock responses to HTTP requests in a single way that can then be applied both in the browser and in a Node.js app on the server. That same mock is happy to run in both places and will mock out those requests to your backend service. This is what the API for Mock Service Worker looks like out of the box. So you define a list of handlers. In this case, we are mocking a GET request to URLs that match this pattern. And you can see the colon ID there is a placeholder. So we will capture the ID in the URL and then respond with a JSON response that uses that captured ID in the response. And the rest of the code is just setting up these mocks in the browser or whatever environment you happen to be deploying them to. In our Storybook integration, this is what those Mock Service Worker mocks look like. This is the real configuration object at the top of the employees page stories in our Storybook. And if I scroll down here, you can see this key called fetch. And it should look pretty familiar. These are a list of MSW mocks, a get, a put, and a post. But at the top, you can see we're also pulling in some standard mocks that we've imported from another file because we need them in a lot of our stories for this app. So again, the fact that this is just a JavaScript file and that you can massage values and compose things to form the configuration objects for your stories comes in really handy, especially when you're doing mocking. The other thing I'll point out here is this pact key at the bottom. If you haven't heard of pact, it is a contract testing toolkit that lets you test and verify that the requests flowing between your front end and your back end still match up at any given time. We have integrated pact with Storybook such that all of the mocks, the MSW mocks you see above, whenever one of them gets called, we record not just the details of the HTTP request that hit that mock, but also the mock response that comes back. After we record all of those API interactions, we then send them to pact, which triggers a build of our backend service. It stands up a real copy of our backend service, sets up its data according to the scenario we've specified, and then replays those interactions that happened in Storybook. It replays those HTTP requests and verifies that the responses match what we need. And so even though these are not end-to-end tests, we are getting a lot of the same guarantees we get from end-to-end tests because every mocked API request in our Storybook gets checked with every build against our backend to make sure that we're not just making up a pleasant fiction here. So we'll add to our list of things that Storybook tests cover full data loading and backend API contracts. And remember, these are not just things you can test with Storybook. These are all the things you test with a single story by default. And so what this does is it means that you test way more with way less code. This is a team at CultureAmp that 3 weeks ago migrated from React testing library tests over to Storybook stories. And in the process, they deleted over 2,000 lines of code and replaced it with just 320 lines of Storybook stories. And I promise this is not a cherry-picked example. This is our typical experience with Storybook at CultureAmp. You can test so much more with so much less code and effort. So that's integration tests. And as you would predict in our testing trophy, it is entirely replaced with Storybook stories. So what about the top of the test pyramid, our end-to-end tests? What do we do about those? Well, at CultureAmp, we are thinking maybe we don't need them at all. Storybook stories, as I've just shown you, are so powerful and they provide so many guarantees that the number of things we really need to point a real browser at a complete copy of our product and all of its services running to verify that things still work together is vanishingly small, to the point that we don't have any standard tooling for this at CultureAmp, and teams are not telling us that they need it. So instead, we kind of practice a bit of self-care and have a ready supply of emergency bourbon if we need it, and decide to make our peace with not doing end-to-end tests, at least not in our development or build pipeline. We certainly do have synthetic tests and smoke tests of our real production environment that let us know if we happen to deploy something that breaks everything, but not as a development tool. Because at the end of the day, when you get far enough along the journey of distributed systems, they seem to mean that full integration only exists in your production environment. So our testing trophy is capped off with a little ball that just says YOLO, you only live once. This ball is there just to represent our lingering uncertainty that this is the right strategy for us. We're only about a year into not writing end-to-end tests for our UI code bases, but so far so good. I'll get back to you if we change our mind. So summing it all up, this is our test trophy for front ends at CultureAmp. At the top, we have maybe nothing. Then we have a bunch of Storybook stories that test view logic, visual rendering, accessibility, localization, interactions, and API contracts, all with a single story. And then we use Jest to write unit tests. We've been playing with vtest, by the way, and we like it better than Jest. It's just a matter of switching cost at this point. And then all of this is supported by a broad base of static types thanks to Typescript. So there you go. That is how Storybook is eating all our tests, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.